Welcome to Mission Forward, a podcast exploring how big ideas and social change take hold. My name is Carrie Fox, and I'm your host. Listen in as we talk with innovative thinkers, makers, and doers in social change, and we explore how foundations, philanthropists, and corporate and community leaders are challenging business as usual in order to move missions forward in meaningful and memorable ways. Today, we are talking empathy as a force multiplier with Ryan Pintado-Vertner. Ryan's the CEO of Smoketown, a boutique consultancy that was built to help early stage and emerging brands across the natural products industry reach their full potential. The reason I'm so excited to talk with Ryan, well, there's a few actually. I heard him speak at a Big Path CEO series earlier this year, and I knew I needed to get to know him better. He and I both believe in supporting and building brands with purpose, and building a world that is more vibrant and better able to support all people well into the future. He and his team at Smoketown tackle this work in the natural foods industry, whereas our team at Mission Partners tackles it in the social impact and philanthropic sector. Today's conversation is going to be so good because we are talking about how issues of empathy, justice, and civility stretch across sectors, and the reason why we must all, regardless of our industry, be committed to building back better. Ryan, I am so glad to have you with us today on Mission Forward. I'm going to start where I start a lot of these conversations, and it's on values. You help brands build their businesses around their values, but we're going to start with yours. How did your values lead you to this work?
I am glad that you started there because it is kind of where I naturally tend to start this conversation. I grew up in a family that was middle class, sometimes more comfortably than others, but generally I had an upbringing where I was blessed to largely not really have to worry about money as a kid. And but that wasn't really true for much of my extended family. And so one of the things that I noticed about myself early on is that when we would have conversations at the dinner table about, family members that were in need or layoffs that had happened or, whatever it was that was going on, I had a level of frustration and disappointment with that from a place of that shouldn't be true. Like people shouldn't be going through that tuned me in relatively early to being fairly highly empathetic, where I just, other people's problems pretty quickly became something that I thought about and worried about. Similarly, around the different dinner table with my grandfather, he would tell these epic stories about growing up in the South. And specifically, my grandfather grew up in a neighborhood in Louisville, Kentucky called Smoketown. That is one of, if not the oldest Black neighborhood in Louisville. He grew up, for those who know it, right almost exactly across the street from University of Louisville Hospital. And in fact, he and my grandmother lived in that same shotgun house that he grew up in for the early part of their marriage too. And he would tell me these stories that were just sometimes too crazy to be believed, of the kinds of things that he saw, what he went through. I applied a race analysis and a power analysis, even at a relatively young age, kind of at the level of my intuition, to stories that he framed as, this is how hard we worked, or this is how crazy it was, or let me tell you a time when. And all that put together just turned me into an activist relatively early in life. My first, I read the autobiography of Malcolm X, changed my life, read a whole lot of stuff. But the first action I took with the action part of the word activism was when I was, I think I was 15. I was in high school, and it was the Rodney King verdict, and got active at my local high school around, organizing a response to that. So, what brings me to to this work and what kind of motivates me in general is that my response to being fairly high on the empathy scale is that I have to do something about this stuff. Different people have different ways of dealing with that, right? My way of dealing with feeling other people's pain and other people's problems is that I have to do something to stop those problems from being real.
Having you tell that story and realizing that you and I were probably in high school around the same time, and the stakes seemed high then. The stakes have seemed high many, many times since then. And then here we are now. And I could have never imagined the stakes being any higher than they are now, right? In the moment that we are in, reflecting on this year of 2020, on how many things have come to pass and bubbled up all at once.
I've been really wrestling with that question. I'd say, literally in the last, call it 48 hours. And, is it that the work is more important and urgent? Or is it that some things that had always been true or that had been true for a decade or more and had been sort of just below the surface are now simply being expressed through the vessel of an entirely undisciplined and incredibly blunt, chief executive who will shamelessly channel the rage that was already there, the depth of the problem. He's a more willing vessel than any prior, than any president that you and I grew up with has been willing to be. Like he's willing to be a vessel. You tell me what I need to say, and I will literally say exactly that thing, unfiltered.
You say vessel, I say puppet, but yes, right.
So what I wonder is it true that the work is more urgent, or is it that the urgency of the work is more obvious because you have this highly public dynamic or that lays bare whatever we might have not fully accepted as a nation?
That's a great question and an important one. And perhaps now the world is more primed for the work that must be done, for the work that should have been done. And here we are, and we'll take it, right? We will take it and we will move it forward. The fact that you do it, not singularly, but so critically through the lens of empathy, right? You are thinking every day about how do we move this work? How do we move this brand forward? Not in a way that this business wants or this leader wants, but in a way that the world needs. And, I'd love you to talk a little bit about that too, the power of looking at all you do, at the decisions that you make, at the way you counsel your clients through that lens of empathy, and what really happens when you shift and make that fully your focus.
Mm-hmm. I got lucky in that, had we had this conversation, 15 years ago before I changed into a career in marketing, I probably wouldn't have been very articulate about empathy as the thing. I would have explained how I'm wired and with some other language that probably got at the same notion, but I don't think I was as clear-eyed about that specific concept until I joined the consumer packaged goods industry. And specifically, I just was, had the incredible luck and blessing to work at the Clorox company at a time when they made a principle or a framework called design thinking. They made it mandatory for people like me. So I was up and coming. I think by that point I was still an associate in the marketing organization and the brand organization. They basically said, you have to get good at design thinking in order to advance in this organization. And the luck of that is that for my money, design thinking, for those who may not be as familiar with it, is one of the most viable, powerful concepts in business, or not just actually to constrain it to business is inappropriate. It's one of the most powerful constructs I've ever encountered for problem solving, and the among other pieces to what design thinking means, one of the things that you do in design thinking very explicitly is you obsess over the problem that you're solving in people's lives. If you look at a design, that's sort of like a typical design thinking roadmap or session, easily half of your time invested in the whole project could be just in understanding at a nuanced level, what problem are we solving in people's lives? And they name that empathy. So what happened for me was I got a chance to work at a company and get trained in a discipline and with some language that named something empathy that I had always felt intuitively, but had not necessarily sort of had the discipline or the structure to turn into such a powerful tool. And so when you fast forward to where I am today, what I now know, having been in the consumer brands world for 13 some odd years now, is that empathy, the ability to really understand the problem that a brand or a product or a service solves at a nuanced level, is a game changer in terms of unlocking that business's value. Because what it means is you're more likely to not just build a exceptionally good solution to the problem, but you're more likely to be able to get to language and framing and branding and architecture. And, the whole process is going to reflect your deeper understanding of what people are actually going through, which will increase loyalty, increase trial, raise competitive barriers that make it hard for knockoffs to match your level of insight. And so where I come at empathy, or as a kid and sort of becoming an adult, I came at empathy, and the outward expression of that empathy was to change the world from an activism standpoint. Marketers and design thinkers and innovators come at empathy, and the outward expression of that is to build great stuff that actually works. And so what I've, sort of stumbled into at this stage of my career in building Smoketown is to lay those two things at an intersection. And it works out that empathy powers both the purpose and the business model success.
Yeah. And what you didn't say, although I think you implied, is the other thing about design thinking is it allows you to challenge your assumptions and challenge where bias lies, right? In terms of saying, this is what we think the solution is. It doesn't matter what we think the solution is. We've got to figure out how people perceive this brand and connect with the brand and value the brand and truly understand it, right? Empathy at the deepest level is also removing a lot of that bias and assumption in the process too.
Very true.
So that's going to bring us to a conversation that I think we've been independently having in our circles, and I want to bring us together on it. And it perhaps the tie to it all, to design thinking and the way business runs. I'm going to take us back for a minute to a New York Times essay, probably more likely than article, but that Milton Friedman wrote 50 years ago this year, when he wrote that business exists to increase profits, and how challenged that idea has become, right? So here we are 50 years later, finally deeply wrestling with the role that business plays and reinforcing bias, reinforcing assumptions, reinforcing racist policies and systems, and taking it further, really keeping Black, Brown, and Indigenous people out of the boardroom, and quite frankly, out of far too many rooms on their way to an executive office. But we are here in this moment in 2020, where B corporations, where purpose-driven companies like ours, where mission-driven leaders are pushing back, saying business as usual hasn't worked, and we can't keep doing it the way that we're doing it. I want to hear a little more about what your take is on this moment that we're in and what it feels like to be leading a purpose-driven business at this time.
One of the critical dynamics that explains where we are and the tipping point that it feels like we've reached is demography. It's that the two youngest generations, Gen Z, which is where I've got two teenagers. So like my teenagers generation and the kids young folks a little older than them. And then millennials who are a couple of years younger than me at the sort of high end of it, at the oldest end of it. They are demographically the most diverse generation in history. They have access to more information than any generation in history. The things that shaped them, if you think about the major, like look at the last 20 years and name the things that shaped the last 20 years, it's a lot of stuff that cuts to the heart of what works and doesn't work in America. You know, the Great Recession. Now we've got COVID-19, school shootings. Like you run the list of stuff that these folks have grown up with as true, and what it leads to, while, you know, it's, of course, there's a bell curve of sort of political perspective, and it's not true that every millennial or Gen Zer is a progressive. Their tendency towards certain progressive ideas, I know for a fact, because, you know, one of the things Smoketown does is consumer research, I have seen firsthand is higher. Like they are more likely to lean into, progressive expectations for how the economy should work better, and progressive expectations for the role that corporations play in civil society, and so the problems have been largely the same. You know, there's progress here and there, and there's backtracking here and there. But in general, you know, the underlying racist structure of the American economy and the gender impacts, all the things that we can talk about, it's not like those things are new. They've been there all along. Corporations have been there all along, with the sort of sometimes on, sometimes off relationship to those challenges. For my money, the big X factor, or the big thing that shifted the dynamic are those two generations. And so what that means for us and how we think about this moment, and how, you know, philanthropists in the audience and your clientele should think about this moment, is actually precisely that there's nothing, this is not a moment at all. Like what this is a building up of the increasing power, influence, role of generations that have totally different expectations of the corporations that they interact with, as they build purchasing power, as they become more and more a greater and greater percentage of the electorate, as they come of age, as they have kids. What we're seeing right now is simply going to accelerate. Like, I think if someone were to plot a graph that showed the popularization of activism and dissent, and figured out how to track its rate of speed, it is accelerating, and it's accelerating, I bet, exactly correlated to the percentage of the U.S. population that those age cohorts represent.
The power of young people to challenge and shift structures, right? It's always been that way, but you're exactly right that the demographics, the power of that voice now is greater than it's ever been. The diversity of that voice. And
they've been through some things that simply didn't give them the option to accept the American dream narrative at face value. I mean, if you're a millennial and you are on the younger end of being a millennial, your formative years, like your formative experience, was big banks, you know, got greedy, kicked a, you know, historic hole in the economy, didn't suffer the consequences. Like that's a formative thing. It's as formative for them as 9/11 was for me, you know?
Right. Right.
So when that's the way you come up, you're going to have to figure out how to define your identity and your point of view relative to that fact. In some cases, maybe you sort of swing libertarian or swing, you know, the conservative into that. Well, you know, I'm sure there's an argument there, or it swings the other way, like Bernie Sanders should be president of the United States. I mean, there is not another scenario. You rewind the clock, and I'm not a political science junkie, so if there are people in the audience who know this, they're going to maybe chop it to pieces. But I'm not sure that you can have a Bernie Sanders that comes this close to being president of the United States absent the demographic and the resulting attitudinal dynamics that I just described. I'm not sure that is viable without that.
And what you're describing, I mean, you are seeing it in your consumer research. You're seeing it with your clients that not just young people, but more and more people are voting with their wallets, right? They're determining what brands they want to be aligned with, what brands they don't. They are not willing to walk away if a brand betrays them in some way. And what's interesting is we're seeing it less from a brand perspective and more, again, from a philanthropic perspective. So, for a lot of young people who can recall their parents or their grandparents writing a check every week to a certain charity, right? That process doesn't happen the same way anymore. That people want to be engaged in brands. They want to know what the philanthropy is doing to affect the systems that have been in place for so long and to challenge the systems that have been in place versus saying, we're going to keep writing that check to the same organization, even though, you know what? Poverty is exactly the same. And in fact, a lot of ways, worse than it was 50 years ago, right? So maybe writing that simple check isn't really the answer anymore. So there's a lot for philanthropy and for nonprofits to be thinking about what's their role in all of this too, just as you're thinking about it through the lens of what's brand's role.
Definitely.
Hi, this is Erin Neal. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at Mission Partners. If you're ready to take your organization, your program, or your big ideas to the next level in 2021, we can help. At Mission Partners, we work with high impact and high potential leaders who are ready to turn their good intentions into greater impact. Whether you need a fresh set of communications to make your message matter or a strategic communications plan to break through the clutter, our team can help you get there. Visit mission.partners for more information on ways we can partner together to move your mission forward.
We knew there were some really important reports that had come out late last year into this year. Before COVID-19 entered our consciousness here, there were calls from economists and experts who predicted that a recession, which folks knew was going to come, would disproportionately affect Black businesses in the U.S., and that making investments to bolster Black-led enterprises would be wise. Now, no one knew how close the time would come to COVID hitting and then what we would see as a result, right? So we know now, there's a report that came out earlier this summer. It was the National Bureau of Economic Research that found the number of African-American business owners plummeted from 1.1 million in February of this year to 640,000 in April. That's a 41% loss in Black-owned businesses compared to 22% of businesses overall on the same time period. So I know you are working very actively in the moment. You have worked for a long time throughout your career to elevate BIPOC leaders in the national products industry. And I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about what you think needs to happen to level the playing field, whether that's in consumer products or otherwise, but to ensure that Black-led and BIPOC leaders across all industries aren't just being set up to weather a storm, because that's what I'm concerned about, but that they are set up to thrive beyond COVID.
You're right that there are a significant number of Black-owned businesses, Black founders in our client base and in our network more broadly, and it is definitely something that we are focused on. And one of the biggest challenges with building a business while Black is access to capital. So just to throw some numbers around, we did a survey of emerging consumer packaged goods brands in the natural products industry. I think the sample size was 120, something like that. And we asked those founders a bunch of questions, including what's your source of financing? And because an emerging brand, one of the most important hurdles that they must clear is ability to manage cash flow, to bridge them from wherever they start to when they need to raise money. And then they must be able to raise money in order to get to the next threshold. It's like a pass-fail situation. More like chutes and ladders. You either raise money and keep moving forward, or 9 times out of 10, you fail to raise money and go out of business. Very stark. And the majority were financed either by friends and family, or they were financed by what we call the seed round, which is kind of like an angel investor that's early. And within that, the largest percentage were bootstrapped and funded by friends and family. So take that fact, and that is broadly replicable. Take that fact and apply it to what's true for the average Black person in America. Statistically speaking, we are less likely to have wealth, less likely to own a home, less like when you think of this, what are the literal sources of capital? Do you have an uncle that you can ask for money from? Do you have a savings account? Do you own a home that you can take out a second mortgage against as a source of financing? Add all of that stuff up. And one of the substantial issues is that there's just not access to capital. So one of the things that has to change in order for this to sort of balance to tip in the long run is that not only do we need to increase access to short-term sources of capital for, in particular, Black-owned businesses, but we also have to give Black folks generally better access to wealth-creating vehicles generally, so that they have the asset base from which to grind out the 5 to 6 years of bootstrapping that's necessary to be an entrepreneur successfully. So I'd say that is like the number 1, number 2, and number 3 issue that needs to be addressed. And then there's a second piece that is, I think, embedded in built-in bias and failure to follow the numbers in sort of the broader consumer packaged goods landscape. I'm speaking still from the CPG lens, I guess. Ultimately, building a really successful business and creating wealth by selling that business to a bigger company who sees its value, that order of operations only works if there's a big business on the other end of it that wants to buy your business. So let's think of one of my favorite brands, Oatly. Oat milk brand, humongous business, not Black owned, but it's just a good case in point. Oatly is on a path to create hundreds of millions of dollars in value, primarily because there is a capital market, or there is a strategic acquisition on the other end of its growth, where they're going to be willing to write them a check that's worth 5 or 6 times the amount of money that company is generating right now. That's how that works. Mm-hmm. Well, if you're a Black-owned business, and let's say your business initially is solving a problem, back to our earlier conversation about design thinking, you're solving a problem that Black folks disproportionately have, or that folks who are low income disproportionately have, or whatever it is. If those problems are less valued by the market, like if the market's like, whatever, like, how are you going to build a business on Black people? Like if that's their perspective, well, you're not going to get to the end there's not going to be someone on the other end who recognizes the value in what you've built and is willing to write you a humongous check for all the sweat and work that you put into it. So I'd say that's the other piece of it.
And certainly not until Wall Street changes what Wall Street looks like, right? Because we've got certain bias and assumptions baked in there in terms of who are we investing in and who are we not. But an interesting trend maybe for both of us to be watching is there is this trend that I'm starting to see of major foundations who have long invested in traditional nonprofit organizations who are now saying, we're going to invest in small businesses. We're going to invest in emerging enterprises. And I think that's going to be interesting too, at how we start to think about other ways that wealth is distributed to ensure that there is enough capital for people with smart ideas and not enough resource to build that idea to be able to grow that in a meaningful way.
Yeah, I think that's long overdue. The asset base of a Ford Foundation or a CS Mott Foundation or, Cerdna, you fill in the blank foundation who have generally progressive values. They're sitting on an asset base where they could reallocate 5% of that asset base,
right,
not make a dent in the endowment's sort of long-term viability, and 5% of that asset base invested in, as a donor-advised fund or in some other mechanism, invested in emerging brands who are both trying to make the world a better place and have the ability to shift wealth and power in certain communities. Mm-hmm. Honestly, they should have been doing this like a decade ago. It's long overdue.
Mm-hmm. And then you start to really see a trickle-down effect in workforce development, in community investment, right? It starts first with making sure that Main Street is strong, right? Much less than Wall Street. Mm-hmm. We're coming to the end of our time. I had a really big question I wanted to ask you, and I'm not sure we've got the time for it. So we might just touch on it, and we'll see where we can go, and maybe it sets us up for a second conversation if you're up for that.
Cool.
I've been listening to your podcast, A Blueprint, and I know recently you did a little shout out to something that you were working on that I'm going to set up here. Maybe we can tease it a little bit, but there are CEOs all over the country who are having similar conversations with their peers as we are, but also with those in their own companies, saying, what is our company's role in addressing big structural inequities? And I can think of no more important question, and I know you want every business to have an answer, that it's never been more important or urgent for leaders of companies to find their role in this fight against structural racism. So I want you to tell me a little bit about Blueprint and how you're challenging businesses to dig into their role on structural racism.
Yeah. We're doing that in a couple of different ways, and I'll address it and we'll either keep the conversation going in the future or we'll get it all done here. So one way that we address it, to your point, is that I have a podcast called Brand New Blueprint. And what Brand New Blueprint is pretty much entirely about is talking to founders and CEOs pretty much exclusively about what their strategies have been to successfully build purpose-driven consumer brands. And sometimes we nerd out on business strategy, sometimes we nerd out on purpose and impact strategy. But what it all adds up to is these are passionate founders who are trying to figure out how to change the world. And so that's what the podcast is about. And then we have a service and offering that we call the Big Fight. And what the Big Fight does is if you picture a Venn diagram, one of the circles is growth strategy. Just generally, what does it take for me to get my $10 million business to be a $100 million business, or my $5 million business to be a $10 million business? The second piece that it answers, so the other circle that's intersecting, is what's my impact strategy? If I'm committed to helping dismantle institutional racism, what is concretely the way that I'm going to do that across all of the resources in my enterprise, to know that I'm not just, doing the occasional, Instagram post and feeling good about myself, but I'm actually moving the ball. I'm actually gaining yardage. So sitting at the intersection of those two things and the overlap is what we call the Big Fight. And it's a service that blends the best of consumer brand strategy with the best of impact strategy and knits it together to give a company a blueprint for how they can both grow the business and also increase the impact that their enterprise has.
That's awesome. Well, I look forward to checking that out, and I will make sure that we include some details on how folks can find that too.
Awesome.
Ryan, it has been so great to talk with you and to learn from you today. Thank you for being so generous with your time after what I know has been a really busy day for you. And I hope we do get a chance to do it again soon.
This was it was an honor. I would do it again in a heartbeat. Great conversation. I'm just really flattered to be part of this. So thank you.
Now, there's a few things that are going to stick with me from this conversation, but one that I want to reinforce before we wrap up is going right back to where we started, and that's on empathy. It's at the heart of building brands with purpose, but it can't be forced and it can't be faked. If you want to build a brand with purpose, you have to start by building relationships honestly and authentically. Don't assume what your customers or clients want, but understand their needs and concerns and build from that perspective. Thanks for listening to another episode of Mission Forward. We're coming to the end of the season, and as always, I would appreciate your feedback on the show. Drop me a line at carrie@mission.partners, and I look forward to seeing you back here for the next episode of Mission Forward.